Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington. We've been listening to President Trump and New York City Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani taking questions from reporters in their first face-to-face meeting, striking a notably and extraordinarily constructive tone with each other. The president calling it a great meeting and praising Mr. Mamdani's victory and wishing him success. We are standing by right now to see if the mayor-elect will speak to reporters gathered outside the Oval Office. That is the expectation. It comes after, during his campaign, Mayor-elect Mamdani said he would be the president's, quote, worst nightmare. And President Trump had called Mamdani a communist lunatic and threatened to cut off billions of dollars in federal funds to the city. But the two rivals telling reporters they've found common ground in their meeting on issues of affordability and crime. Take a listen.
We've just had a great meeting, a really good, very productive meeting. We have one thing in common. We want this city of ours that we love to do very well. But I just want to congratulate. I think you're going to have, hopefully, a really great mayor. The better he does, the happier I am, I will say. There's no difference in party. There's no difference in anything. And we're going to be helping him to make everybody's dream come true, having a strong and very safe New York. And congratulations, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Please.
I appreciated the meeting with the president, and as he said, it was a productive meeting focused on a place of shared admiration and love, which is New York City, and the need to deliver affordability to New Yorkers, the 8.5 million people who call our city their home, who are struggling to afford life in the most expensive city in the United States of America. We spoke about rent, we spoke about groceries, we spoke about utilities, we spoke about the different ways in which people are being pushed out, and I appreciated the time with the president. I appreciated the conversation. I look forward to working together to deliver that affordability for New Yorkers.
The warm optics just extraordinary after months of these two men trading barbs against each other. All of that dropped today with this Oval Office visit. Mr. Mamdani also asked by reporters if he was going to retract his past attacks on the president. He dodged, saying both he and the president speak their mind. The president downplayed the attack, saying he's been called a lot worse. The constructive and friendly tone of this meeting decidedly different than what we heard during the mayoral campaign, where the president played an outsized role in setting off a fierce political rivalry.
I am Donald Trump's worst nightmare as a progressive Muslim immigrant who actually fights for the things that I believe in. Our city is under attack by an authoritarian Trump administration.
I call him my little communist. He's my little communist mayor. It's going to be hard for me as the president to give a lot of money to New York because if you have a communist running New York, all you're doing is wasting the money you're sending there.
If anyone can show a nation betrayed by Donald Trump how to defeat him, it is the city that gave rise to him. So hear me, President Trump, when I say this. To get to any of us, you will have to get through all of us.
Just as a little reminder, last month, the Trump administration froze $18 billion in infrastructure projects for the city during the government shutdown. And as we heard, the president has threatened more cuts. I will be speaking to Mayor-elect Mamdani exclusively. We will bring that to you on Sunday on Meet the Press, fresh off his meeting with President Trump and as he readies for the realities of governing the country's largest city, what has been described as the hardest job in politics next to the president. NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake joins me now from outside the White House. Garrett, boy, you and I have spent all day, all week trying to think about what is this meeting going to look like between President Trump and Mayor-elect Mamdani. And there it was, a bromance was formed with President Trump saying that he thinks that Mayor-elect Mamdani is going to do a good job. They said that they talked about various issues from affordability to ICE to crime to safety. But on each of these notes, Garrett, President Trump making it clear he believes they found common ground. And really what we're seeing is a populist thread between these two men.
That's exactly right. I mean, look, we knew there would be fireworks, but these appeared to be the celebratory kind here today as a worst nightmare turned into a potential dream partnership here for these two politicians who, Kristen, I think you nailed it, are united by a couple of things. Number one, a focus, at least in this moment, on affordability. The president and this White House understands that's a big reason why they struggled in the elections earlier this month was the perception that they've not sufficiently addressed the cost of living crisis around this country. That was the mayor-elect's core campaign theme. They both want to see prices go down, affordability go up. They're united by that issue politically. They're also united by about 10% of their voters, which is a fascinating statistic borne out by our own NBC News exit polls that shows roughly 10% of people who pulled the lever for Donald Trump in November of 2024 turned around and pulled it for Mayor-elect Mamdani in this cycle. And the mayor-elect, I think, has executed this pretty well, playing up that connection with the president, playing up the idea that there are perhaps more things they agree upon than that they disagree upon. Our colleague Ryan Nobles likes to say, he's exactly right, that the political spectrum is a circle, not a line. You go far enough in one direction, you end up back on the other side. And I think they're also united by kind of this nostalgic love for New York City that President Trump always displays. He's a Florida man now, but make no mistake, the persona that is Donald Trump, the person who became the president of the United States, is very much a creature of New York City. And to the degree that the mayor-elect was able to play to that side of him to say, we both want the same thing, they may have slightly different visions of what it means, but of greatness for New York City. That is like a coded message straight to the heart of Donald Trump, and we saw it play out in real time there with the president even going so far as to deflect questions he perceived to be hostile away from the mayor-elect so that they wouldn't get bogged down in their budding bromance.
Well, Garrett, I know you are there. It is an incredibly busy day for you and the other correspondents at the White House. You're all gathered there outside of the West Wing, hoping that the mayor-elect will stop and take a few more questions. So we are going to let you go so you can get back to your other post. Please come back and join us once that gaggle is over. We really appreciate your reporting, Garrett. I do now want to bring in our fantastic Friday panel. Tia Mitchell, Washington Bureau Chief for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Meghan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden. And Ashley Davis, a former White House official in the George W. Bush administration and former Homeland Security official. Thanks to all of you for being here. Tia, I don't know where to start.
That's a lot.
Look, I knew that this would probably be more conciliatory than we had certainly seen when Mayor-elect Mamdani was out on the campaign trail. But I think no one could have anticipated the level of warmth, joviality between these two leaders. President Trump saying some of his ideas are the same ideas that I have. He said, I want to help him, not hurt him. And you heard Mayor-elect Mamdani say part of how I won was talking to President Trump's voters, figuring out what they want. What did you make of what we just witnessed?
I mean, I think Donald Trump got some of that Mamdani magic that explains how he is now going to become New York City's mayor, which was that a lot of people who maybe assumed the worst about him, assumed that a democratic socialist they wouldn't be able to relate to, when they took the time to listen to what Mayor-elect Mamdani had to say, they were like, hey, I kind of can find some places where I agree with the guy. And I think that happened with President Trump today. I also think the mayor-elect smartly went into this wanting to make nice with the president. It's clear that he came in with that attitude, that he worked hard to make it go well today. I think he probably worked hard to get his messaging and his approach figured out ahead of time so that it would go today, and it looks like it paid off.
You know, Ashley, to that point, one of the aspects of this that I was focused on was the policy aspect. Would Mayor-elect Mamdani get any assurances from President Trump when it comes to sending the National Guard into New York, when it comes to cutting off funding? Remember, that was one of the big threats. President Trump signaled right now he's not planning to cut off funding to New York. He said, look, we'll see. But it seems like Mayor-elect Mamdani actually is going to walk out of this meeting with something significant.
Well, he actually said several times, I'm going to help you as well, which in my mind meant money. But Look, and we were talking about this a little earlier. President Trump loves a winner, and Mamdani defied all odds, just like President Trump did in 2016 and won. But also, I'm just sitting here. We've all been in the West Wing. We all know how that intense, most powerful spot in America is. And Mamdani, at 34 years old, standing by the President of the United States, who he just, fought with for the last 9 months. It's actually amazing. I'm going to be an optimist on this. I mean, it was very shocking, but I hope that it continues.
Meghan, you're less of an optimist. How are Democrats going to view this display, this warmth, this bromance? How do you think this is going to play with the Democratic?
Look, I think that Tia's right that Mamdani came in with the right messaging. He knew he had to get this right. But also, this is one of Trump's worst weeks in office. The Epstein files were voted out, so they have to release the Epstein files. He had Saudi Arabia here where his corruption was on full display. His poll numbers are at a record low for his second term. So this is not just, and he was calling press names all week. So he has not had one good story this week. And so I really think that he knows, speaking to your point, that Mamdani is a winner. He knows that the affordability message is something he needs to work on, and hooking his wagon to Mamdani is really smart for him to do right now.
Talk about that affordability.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I wonder if this meeting took place, obviously it wouldn't have, before the primary, with all the messages that were given to the president about what voters are caring about, which is affordability, if it would have been like this. Because he really, Mamdani's message is exactly what the president should be right now.
And he's not doing it. And so he is hitching his wagon to a star, and Donald Trump is really actually doing something smart and playing politics correctly here.
Tia, what do you make of that, the political backdrop to all of this that Meghan talks about? The fact that it has been a tough week politically for President Trump in a lot of these Oval Office appearances this week. For example, when he was sitting next to MBS answering questions that were incredibly difficult, from the Trump family's business entanglements with Saudi Arabia to obviously the killing of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. This was a very different tone. Clearly he was enjoying this, but did it allow him to turn the page on what was a difficult week?
I mean, I agree. This is what I think a lot of people have been telling Donald to do it. As you've talked about, just New York City has a special place and go into it with a positive attitude. But I will also say, I think there are a lot of voters at home who are like, this is what we expect from the president and our elected officials, that they are able to put the campaigning aside and sit down and talk about how they can work together for the good of voters. Like, it shouldn't be so surprising and fresh what happened today. It should be normal doing business. But unfortunately, in this political climate, this seems to, we are surprised that things went so well today.
Ashley, what about that? And could this, Meghan's making the point, there might be some in the Democratic base who don't love these optics. Could there be some in the Republican base who are saying he's actually gotten too chummy?
I'm not sure. I mean, listen, I think that how President Trump won was because of all the different groups he brought together. This is, and that's exactly who a lot of the Mamdani voters are. Obviously, we said that there were 10%. But what I really watch is, if you look at like AOC, who's going to probably run for president or Senate, she as a Republican makes me the most nervous to run against, because she can form that same coalition. No one else, I'm like one of the few that are saying this, but she can energize people like Mamdani did, like Trump did, that no other candidate can. So I actually think this is American people who just feel left behind by our federal government or corporate America, that just want somebody to make change.
And on your point with the Republicans, I actually do think a lot of Republicans sitting at home are very upset, because they have spent months trying to make Mamdani the boogeyman and socialism the boogeyman here, and to run on that, and every Democrat's now a socialist. They are all now very disappointed that Donald
consultants are
That's right. This stood from the Oval Office saying, we're going to help him, not hurt him.
This is such a great point. I mean, Ashley, President Trump had his foil. He called him a communist. I didn't hear him say that today in the Oval Office. And he was prepared to wrap Mamdani around the entire Democratic Party, to make him the face of the Democratic Party we're running against. We heard that from his press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, who said it's just remarkable that Democrats have elected a communist who's is now coming to the White House. Does today make that argument more difficult and thereby having that foil heading into the midterms?
Yeah, and by the way, like by next Friday, this could be all blown up.
Totally.
So, I mean, I'm not like, I'm realistic as well. But I also think that he had to do this in regards to the affordability, as we already said. But I also think that if he is going to turn the page for the midterms, he has to be able to talk differently. And this is not what he's been doing.
Tia, what do you think in terms of this kumbaya moment, how long does it last? And, because now Mayor-elect Mamdani's got to get to work.
Yeah.
And that's when the rubber meets the road and when President Trump can point to, I disagree with X, Y, and Z, and vice versa. That's when it gets difficult.
Yeah, I think it's going to get difficult, but I think, for Mamdani, he just wanted a positive start. I think if Democrats or voters who supported Mamdani are going to be discouraged, it won't be making nice with President Trump in the Oval Office. 'Cause I think everybody understands why he needs to do that, especially if he wants to make sure that Trump, using the federal government, doesn't do things to make it harder for Mamdani to carry out his agenda. I think what voters are going to be looking at is Mamdani willing to make good on what he promised? Now, if it looks like cozying up to Trump causes him to come back from some of the things he promised on the campaign trail, I think that's when voters are going to get upset. And that's where it's going to be hard for him to, walk that fine line of what can he do, how far can he go with the things he promised before, if any of those things do cause President Trump to say, no, I don't want you doing that, and then what does he do then?
Probably who's most upset today on this press conference is Elise Stefanik.
Well, and her name was invoked.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking, she goes back
running for governor.
Us, but that's what she's going to run on. But one thing that I did want to say is no one answered the question of how they agreed on the policies today. However, no one agreed on how they're going to pay for them. And that's where that's where we're going to have a divide.
And finally to you, Meghan, how long do you think these vibes last between President Trump and Mayor-elect Mamdani?
I mean, I don't think they last very long, but we have a while until he's inaugurated and actually is the mayor and actually has to govern. So, I mean, as soon as he, as you said, as soon as he does something that Trump doesn't like, it's going to flip. The switch will flip. I mean, Trump is not known for being able to keep himself in check. So this, it might not even last 24 hours. Who knows?
All right. Well, stand by for me. I want to go out to Garrett Haake back at the White House. So, Garrett, it turns out, despite his campaign saying so, he may not talk to reporters after all. Is that maybe because the Oval Office Q&A went so long? What are you hearing?
It may be that, and it may also be that he is still going to talk to reporters, but not here on campus. We're hearing that he may be talking in the park across the street. Kristen, it is a little bit of a run-and-gun news environment here at the White House now, but whether or not there's a gaggle or not, probably not the mystery out of this meeting today, although I think there are a lot of follow-up questions for how the mayor-elect might feel about the president now that the president's not sitting at his left hand. Whether we get those answers today or Sunday morning on Meet the Press remains an open question.
Well, I appreciate that tease very much, Garrett. Thank you.
I do what I can.
Garrett, from your perspective, as someone who's followed the Trump administration for quite some time, talk a little bit about how you see this relationship evolving, because obviously we're all very focused on the optics and what was said today. The fact that President Trump says he wants to help, not hurt him. He seemed to pull back on his threat to withhold federal funds to New York City. But how do you see this evolving once Mayor-elect Mamdani is sworn into office and then starts implementing some of his plans?
Well, look, there's sort of political and practical implications on this. On the practical side of it, I think what the president said is, at least in some major measure, true. They both want to see New York City be successful, and I think that means the same thing to both of them in certain categories. A more affordable New York City, check. A lower crime New York City, check, although New York City is historically one of the lowest crime rates for major cities in this country, so that might be a victory that can be declared kind of sooner rather than later. But politically speaking, I think there is probably a model here, to me, Kristen, and I think it's the Gavin Newsom model. This is a president who respects winners. He respects people who he thinks are at the top of their game. He likes having a foil, someone that he can spar with who he feels like is on his level. Newsom has held a similar role where they trash talk each other, they run against each other, but it's clear that the president has a grudging respect for him, and they have a relationship that exists when the cameras are not there, where they kind of work together for the state of California. I could imagine a similar dynamic here developing with the mayor where, you know, almost like I go back to this all the time. Donald Trump is the only president to also be a member of the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame. That is a true statement, where when they're in the ring, they're smashing each other with the steel chairs. When they're backstage, they're having a beer and talking about what a good show they put on. There's a certain element here where both of these men can use each other politically and then at the end of the day, shake hands and say, that was a pretty good fight. Did we get anything done? I could foresee a relationship like that developing, but as we've all learned over the last 10 years, making predictions about Donald Trump is a very dangerous game, and I won't go any farther than that.
It sure is. Well, you laid the groundwork very well. Garrett, Haake, thank you so much for being with us. I know a lot of moving parts at the White House. Really appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.